Ladies and gentlemen, I'm now talking no longer about ethics and politics in general. I'm talking about ethics and politics in modernity. And my thesis, my point is, not just my own point, is that the disjunction between politics and individual morality operated by Niccolò Machiavelli marks the opening of modernity as much as the discoveries by Copernicus and Galileo and Newton mark the opening of modernity in science. What does Machiavelli mean in this sense? He says in The Prince that since men are wicked, the prince who insists on goodness would ruin himself and his state. This should not be, however, read as Machiavelli making a case for vice and wickedness, as Machiavelli's travesty in Protestant countries wanted to have it. It's rather a refreshing cleavage that made other things possible. Modernity is not just this separation or disjunction, is also something else. Modernity is also characterized by the attempt, by the contrary pole, by the attempt to redefine and justify the unity of individual morality and politics. This is what Kant attempts to do at the end of Eternal Peace, and not to. This is the best known document of this attempt made by Kant. And another strain, another current is also the effort to elaborate a specifically political ethics. Politics is not free of ethics or simply contrary to individual morality or disjoined by individual morality. It has an ethics of its own. And this starts again with Machiavelli himself, particularly in the discourse on the first 10 books of Livy. And this develops later on into the theory of republican virtues. What is a republican virtue in the worst case, in the most extreme case? It's the ability to do something wicked, something bad, a murder, for instance, killing the tyrant, on behalf of one's own country's safety and glory. Read again Shakespeare's Julius Caesar, and in the figures of Brutus and Cassius you find a seminal example, let's say, of republican virtues. This story can be told also under a different heading. The heading, the title, Idealism or Normativism versus Realism. We have already approached this distinction, this concept in one of the first lectures, so I don't need to dwell for a long time on this point. I will say something more about realism. Realism is not simply to look at things as they are. Realism is certainly an approach to politics which is more interested in how politics effectively works according to its own features and to its own logic. But realism also contains, let's say, substantive positions, substantive points. It begins with men and women, of course, but in the classical language of political realism, they said only men, with the need of the political man for security, which a security that can be attained only in the community, and by community, the single limited community of a city or of a town or of a country is meant, not the globe. And this explains in realist terms how the necessity of ensure security results in a struggle for hegemony, and this justifies the primacy of the state, also the primacy of the state's ethics, of the ragion di Stato over individuals and humanity. Three more points very briefly. It is realism, not idealism, for manifest reasons, that made political science possible. The scientific approach to what happens in politics. Realism can be subdivided into anthropological and structural realism. Anthropological realism has to do with a certain conception of man, as in Machiavelli. Structural realism, well, you remember perhaps Ken Waltz's three images of war. The last image, it's an example of structural realism. And last not least, please do not merge political realism in science with political realism in politics. At least in recent times, political realism in politics, particularly in foreign policy, has been understood as let's say, an agreement or support for the policies pursued by the former US President George W. Bush. Remember that in political theory there have been conservative realists and reformist realists. And that was it about idealism and realism.